At first I thought it was the forge, burning.
In that time,
Annatar, Lord of Gifts.
What if I told you that the most powerful men in Middle-earth were once ordinary kings, living in kingdoms filled with glory, wealth, and unimaginable power? They were given gifts, tokens of unimaginable allure, rings that could grant them dominion over the world, make them invincible, and help them live forever. But what if those very gifts twisted them into the most terrifying servants of evil ever known? The 9 rings, crafted by the elven smiths of Eregion, would do just that, turning men into shadows of their former selves, the Nazgûl. But how did these men, these kings, fall so far? How did they go from powerful rulers to soulless wraiths, bound to the will of the Dark Lord, Sauron? Today, we're going to dive deep into the creation of the 9 rings and their dark transformation. We'll explore how Sauron's insidious influence took root in the hearts of men and turned them into Sauron's most fearsome servants.
Ultimate corruption. Sauron, the Dark Lord.
Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button if you're fascinated by the history of Middle-earth, and make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get into it. The Rings of Power and Celebrimbor's craft. The story of the 9 rings begins long before Sauron's full rise to power. It starts in the Second Age, in the land of Eregion, where the elven smith Celebrimbor, a grandchild of the great Fëanor, forged the Rings of Power. Celebrimbor was an extraordinarily talented craftsman, revered by both elves and men alike. Alongside other elven artisans, he sought to create rings that would enhance the abilities of those who wore them. But Celebrimbor did not craft these rings alone. He was deceived by Annatar,
A sharer of gifts. Annatar,
a figure who claimed to be a benevolent spirit sent to help the elves. Annatar, who was none other than Sauron in disguise, whispered sweet promises of power, immortality, and dominion over all of Middle-earth. His charm was undeniable, and Celebrimbor, along with the other elven smiths, fell under his influence. Sauron taught them how to forge the Rings of Power, each ring holding its own unique attributes. There were the 3 rings for the elves, which were the most potent and pure, as Celebrimbor had crafted them without Sauron's direct influence. But then came the 7 rings for the dwarves, and most significantly, the 9 rings for men, which would serve as the central focus of this tale. The 9 rings, however, were not just ordinary treasures. Sauron had designed them with a very specific purpose in mind: to dominate men, whose desire for power was far more susceptible to corruption due to their mortality. Unlike elves or dwarves, men were bound by time. Their lifespans were short, and their ambition often burned hotter because of it. These qualities made them the perfect targets for Sauron's grand scheme. Sauron's true intentions and the allure of power. Sauron, in his ultimate ambition to rule Middle-earth, knew that dominating the free peoples of the world would take more than brute force. He understood that men, more than any other race, were driven by their desires: power, wealth, and immortality. He played on these desires, offering the 9 rings as the ultimate tools to achieve their deepest yearnings. Sauron's goal was simple: to subjugate all of Middle-earth under his rule. The Rings of Power were designed as a means of control, with the 1 ring at the center of his plan. The 1 ring was the most powerful of all the rings, created by Sauron himself. It was the tool that would allow him to control all the other rings and their bearers. With the 1 ring, he could manipulate the minds of those who wore the other rings, bending them to his will. The 9 rings, in particular, were tailored to tempt the human kings, the most vulnerable to corruption. These kings were offered unimaginable power, the ability to live longer, to control their realms with absolute authority, and even to stave off death. For a mortal, this was an offer far too great to resist. Each ring imbued with Sauron's dark power, began to exert its influence on its bearer almost immediately. The moment a king donned the ring, he felt his power grow exponentially. His kingdom flourished, and his enemies fell before him. But over time, the ring began to twist his mind, cloud his judgment, and warp his desires. The kings, once noble men, started to crave more power, more control, and more dominance over the world around them. But they could not see the price they were paying. They were slowly being consumed by the rings. Their very humanity was being drained away. The transformation into the Nazgûl. It wasn't long before the 9 kings who had received the rings began to change. Over the centuries, the power of the rings took hold of their minds and bodies. They became more and more dependent on the rings, unable to survive without them. With each passing year, their mortal forms began to wither, and they were increasingly isolated from the world around them. The rings, once symbols of power, had become their shackles. As Sauron's influence grew stronger, the 9 kings were no longer able to control their own fate. They became mere shadows of their former selves, enslaved by the power of the rings. Their bodies withered, and their souls were trapped between life and death. They became the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, Sauron's most feared servants. The Nazgûl were no longer human, but they were not truly dead either. They existed in a wraith-like state, bound to the will of Sauron through the power of the One Ring. The 9 kings had been reduced to hollow, empty shells, their minds enslaved by the Dark Lord. They no longer had any free will, only the drive to obey Sauron's commands. Their once proud kingdoms had crumbled, and they were now nothing but shadows, slaves to the very power they had once sought to control. The 9 rings, which had been created to grant power, had instead turned their bearers into something far worse, soulless wraiths bound to the will of their master. The allure of power had been their undoing. What they thought would make them invincible had, in fact, made them utterly powerless. The dark allure of the rings, a cautionary tale. The story of the 9 rings is not just one of power and corruption, but also of the dangers of unchecked ambition. The kings of men were not evil in the beginning. They were simply ambitious, hungry for power and immortality. But in their desire to rule, they fell prey to Sauron's manipulation. They were offered the world, but at a great cost, their souls. The 9 rings show the peril of being blinded by ambition. The rings promised their bearers the ability to rule, to live forever, but in the end, they took everything from them. The kings became shadows of their former selves, and their kingdoms fell into ruin. The Nazgûl were no longer rulers. They were instruments of destruction, mere tools in Sauron's quest for dominance. Once bound to the rings, they lost their free will, becoming slaves to Sauron's will, forever bound to the darkness they had once sought to master. This dark allure of power remains a cautionary tale for us all. It reminds us that power, when sought for its own sake, can corrupt even the noblest of men, and once corrupted, it is nearly impossible to break free. The rings of power are a symbol of the seductive nature of unchecked desire and the terrifying cost of sacrificing one's soul for control. The more one seeks to control the world, the more one risks losing themselves in the process. The legacy of the 9 rings. The 9 rings left a legacy of fear and darkness in Middle-earth. The Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, were some of the most terrifying figures in all of Tolkien's work. They served Sauron faithfully, hunting down his enemies and spreading terror wherever they went. Their very existence was a testament to the corrupting influence of the rings and the eternal bond between Sauron and the 9 kings who once wore them. Though the 9 rings were lost at the end of the Third Age, their story is far from over. The Nazgûl remain a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the seductive power that can lead even the greatest of men to their doom.